Welcome to Our Thoughts Tonight. Join us as we chat in a mellow mood about music, philosophy, psychology, and anything else that will come to mind. Enjoy!
All right, welcome to Our Thoughts Tonight. I am here with Ashik.
Hello, everybody.
And I'm your host, Alex Trebek.
Alex Trebek. I want another interview for $400.
So today, our guest on the show is David from Theory and Philosophy on YouTube, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
I always get it backwards sometimes with philosophy and theory, but Theory and Philosophy.
Yeah. Does philosophy and theory just roll off the tongue easier?
Honestly, I think Theory and Philosophy is way better.
Yeah.
It's just I'm dyslexic, so
it emphasizes the theory more, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
An early episode of Our Thoughts Tonight.
Right, yeah. It's one of those few early episodes instead of, so it's not really Our Thoughts Tonight. It's more like Our Thoughts This Morning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you normally record at night then?
Usually around 9 p.m. to 10 p.m.
Yeah.
But
okay.
And usually it's after a work day, so the cognitive ability is a little bit slowed down after a long day's work, but in the morning hopefully a little sharper than usual.
Right. Yeah, all of our interviews have been in the mornings, actually. I've just noticed.
Yeah,
right.
Morning or afternoon.
Right.
Anyway, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm just coming out of, where I am right now in Quebec in Canada. Everything's just gone into pretty serious lockdown once again, and there's they've instituted a curfew, so just getting ready to bunker down and get some reading done, essentially.
Oh, well, yeah. I wanted to ask you, for our listeners, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself for anyone who might not be familiar with your channel and yourself?
Yeah, for sure. I can definitely fill in some of those blanks. As you mentioned, my YouTube channel is called Theory and Philosophy. It's also a podcast, and you can find that pretty much anywhere where you find podcasts. And what I do is pretty much just cover texts. I don't really produce essays per se for these media. I just cover texts, essays, books, and so on to try to make them accessible to people, because I did my undergrad in English. And then afterwards, I moved into continental philosophy, or a program that focuses on continental philosophy. And I was just overwhelmed and didn't really know what was going on. And so I took it upon myself to read as much as I could. And in that process, I thought, well, wouldn't it be good if I could try to help other people with reading some of these things? And then it just kind of snowballed from there and just kept going. And now I'm currently on the tail end, hopefully, of my PhD in media studies at the University of Western Ontario in Ontario, Canada. And I do my stuff currently on conspiracy theories. So I kind of inhabit two different worlds. There's that world of thought on one hand, and then my interest in theory and philosophy on the other. And they don't really bridge all too much. So they're just separate things that tend to take up most of my time. And otherwise, I just hang out with my cats pretty much and play guitar.
Oh, wow.
That's very cool. Would you mind elaborating a little bit on your media studies in relation to conspiracy theories? Like, in which way would that be related?
That's a good question. The program I'm in is rather interdisciplinary. So as far as the theoretical leanings of the department or its methodological leanings, it borrows from a whole array of different disciplines. So from gender studies to philosophy to cultural studies and so on. And so my approach to it is motivated by a desire to essentially understand whether or not we can study conspiracy theories in terms of them being true or not. And what I mean by that is that there are entire camps of thought that look at conspiracy theories and base not only a conspiracy theory's legitimacy, but also the legitimacy of it being studied on the possibility that the conspiracy theory might be true. So they say, well, there might be some weight to this conspiracy theory, so we have to take it seriously. My point is that conspiracy theories do things, even if they aren't true. Like, I guess in short, I'm kind of like, who cares? Because they still exist. They still have effects. Now, with that being said, I think that that's those projects are extremely important. But there are very few efforts so far, really, to dig into what conspiracy theories mean. Now, as far as the nitty gritty of it, I try to apply an intersectional lens, taking a lot of critical race and feminist stuff to understand conspiracy theories in terms of their locations. Like, for example, can we really say that Alex Jones saying that, water is going to turn the frogs gay, or whatever, homophobic thing he might say given any day, is that really the same thing as when, for example, Spike Lee says that AIDS was designed in a lab to depopulate the Black population in the United States and elsewhere? Now, and my point is simply that these things aren't the same, even though they are both conspiracy theories. And my task is to try to unravel them, try to develop a way to look at them differently and to really parse through them and understand them differently.
Wow,
that's my thing.
That's really amazing, honestly. And I want to bring up the fact that what you said initially about how, though they may not be true, they do have effects, which kind of reminds me a lot of semiotics, I think it would be considered. Like, how like numbers aren't essentially or exactly a real thing. They're just a symbol, but they do have meaning.
Yeah, arguably, yeah. Right.
And now, like, only over the last year personally have I been delving into like postmodern philosophies and stuff. And now that's starting to make so much sense and starting to make so much sense of the world for me, from my perception, I should say. So that's really cool that you say that. So I don't know if that's your personal take on it or like something that you came up with, but it's pretty profound, I would say. Simple, but profound.
Yeah, right. I don't think I've had any real original thought ever in my life. I just synthesize other people's thoughts and try to come up with something new that is just a mix of other people's brilliance.
Right.
Yeah, that seems to be what all the best ones are, though, right?
Yeah, it's the I don't know. There's a whole term for it where, like, you think you're thinking of something new, but like it's just been thought of before. That usually happens a lot of philosophy, obviously. And I wouldn't, this might kind of later on in the interview with Baudrillard and stuff, but like I would imagine a lot of various different philosophies going into conspiracy theories, just a mere fact of like, different subjective views on it. Obviously some people think they're true, and how they treat that. So I definitely see the connection there. I guess I wanted to maybe shift that a little bit more into the actual philosophy areas of things. So I guess in terms of your channel, just for the audience, what kind of philosophy or particular philosophers do you like to focus on? I know you mentioned continental philosophy earlier on as a particular interest.
Yep. I try to be as broad as I can. So if anyone went and looked at what I've covered, I cover stuff from ancient Greece to 17th, 18th century European German idealism, for example, with the work of Immanuel Kant and Hegel and others, maybe not others in that camp yet. I don't even remember what I've covered at this point. Into the 20th century with post-World War II thinkers that actually really considered the ramifications of World War II and what it really represented, with people like Hannah Arendt, and then people in the quasi-Marxist Frankfurt School, the Theodor Adornos and Herbert Marcuse's and Walter Benjamins of the world, to post-structuralist thought with the thinking of Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Jean Baudrillard, and including others. And I also try to include as many diverse perspectives as I can. So including as much as I can, post-colonial thought, work by Black and Indigenous authors, mostly women, that really speak to not only histories of oppression that directed against these people, but ongoing forms of repression directed against them. And I personally find the most interest in those perspectives of all the stuff I've covered. And this is actually kind of funny. All the stuff I've covered, probably Immanuel Kant is my favorite in this domain called philosophy. Yet he's the one that I screwed up the most.
Screwed up?
On your channel or?
On my channel, yeah. So his kind of his corpus, for me, the most important texts are the three critiques. So the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of judgment. And I think I handled the critique of practical reason and the critique of judgment, so the second and the third, quite well. The critique of pure reason, on the other hand, I was not prepared for. I was like a kid walking to an exam without having studied anything at all. And I just thought I understood it, but I fear, and I know for a fact, I didn't treat it with the kind of care that it deserved, which is ironic because that's probably one of my favorite books of all time. So yeah, that sort of answered your question and gone around in various different tangents. I try to cover many different perspectives in this domain called philosophy, in this domain called theory. What I know about the difference between the two, that is between theory and philosophy, is another question. And I don't know if I have a sufficient answer. I don't know if anyone really does. But those have been my primary interests.
And I just to follow up on Kant. So I have an undergrad in philosophy, and I do have a particular interest in Kant as well. So like, would you consider yourself like an agreeant? He's an old philosopher at this point, so there's different ideas that's developed and not. But like, just out of curiosity, would you consider yourself a transcendental idealist, or would you actually agree with Kant, or do you just like the texts, or
all of the above?
Yeah.
I think that Kant was right, and in every single way, which is a pretty drastic thing to say, but the way that he just schematized perception, or tried to understand the necessary elements of human cognition that allow for perception to be possible, I think is without parallel, in my opinion, with what I've read so far. And to be quite frank, I'm not nearly as well read as many people, including many of my friends and other people who do YouTube stuff or other podcast stuff in these fields. But in my opinion, Kant is without parallel in schematizing these processes. And the conclusions he extrapolates from that, I think, are spot on, in that, as opposed to Hegel, and Hegel is someone I have kind of a love-hate relationship with. Hegel kind of, this might get me shot by some reviewers, but Hegel bores me in that he makes certain leaps in judgment that I find really hard to swallow. For example, he has certain leanings that aren't quite, they aren't very savory to me, including his absolute love of Christianity, and that coming out through like very clearly in his text. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing on its own, but it was in part for me. It is a limitation there. Whereas someone like Kant, who is also very religious, says, he's like, I can't prove that there's a God through religion. No one can. The only possible proof that I might be able to give that there's a God we have to step away entirely from religion and look at this thing called human perception, to look at our faculties to understand the world, to maybe give a genuine argument of that doesn't just say, well, it must be true. Christianity is the highest order of possible religious life, which is kind of what you get at the end of the phenomenology of spirit with Hegel, that everything comes down to Christ, essentially. Which is like, really? I mean, you aren't really giving us a possibly universal philosophy here. You're giving us a very, European one, right. Middle Eastern one. Like this is quite limited.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I totally agree with the love-hate relationship. Like, you get a lot of good stuff, in my opinion, with like, I guess early on the phenomenology with like sense certainty and stuff like that. I think there's some insights there, but yeah, you definitely see his like political leanings and social leanings towards the end. That's for sure.
And that's it. Like, and I feel like so many people don't actually go and read the whole thing, because it gets like at the end, like it's a religious text. We talk about sense perception, and it's like, oh, that's great. I mean, that, you have this, Lord Bondsman dynamic, and that's great. Like, that's cool stuff. But Hegel doesn't like that stuff. Hegel says, this is not where spirit resides. I mean, these are the phases we have to essentially move through to arrive at this final thing, like this absolute knowing, this absolute religion. And it's something that baffles me, in that I see so many people that are like, oh, Hegel, yeah, master slave dialectic. It's like, no, he wasn't satisfied with that. Like, I don't. Right. It's like, yeah. Anyways, I have strong feelings about this.
Well, just a quick, I guess, final question on this German idealist side is like, I don't think you've covered any Schopenhauer on your channel as far as I know, and I would assume you would find some agreements, because considering his trashing of Hegel, although on different terms.
Yeah, I have not covered Schopenhauer. And one of the reasons for that is that I've covered Nietzsche, and Nietzsche borrows quite heavily from Schopenhauer. I want to, I just haven't really taken the time to. But you get the same thing as well in Kierkegaard. Yeah, in his criticism of German idealism as just being not religious enough, essentially, which is like ironic. I don't really jive with Kierkegaard all that much, but at least he's like quite upfront about it. He's like, I'm just interested in God and what it means for us to be in the eye of God. What does that mean for decision making? What does that mean for how to live a fruitful life? Which I totally respect. Great. If you want to do that, go for it. But yeah, that's right. No Schopenhauer yet.
Yeah.
So I want to ask, as a fellow YouTuber, you say you messed up the video on Kant. It was Critique of Pure Reason, right? That you feel that you didn't do too well on. Have you thought about redoing it?
Yes, very much so. The only thing that's been holding me back is, well, I have other things to do, but and it is a long book. Yeah, I would like to at some point, just because the way I approached it, I don't think that I said anything wrong. But one of the things that I try to do with these videos that I do, and this podcast, is to try to make text accessible so that you can listen and know what's going on. With that one, I didn't know what was going on, and so I just would. I remember I would just read like long segments and be like, I don't know what this means. This is what he says, so figure it out yourself. I'm like, that's not my job, but that's what I had to resort to. And
a lot of the videos I've watched, I've read either large chunks of the text or I've read the text. And I think you do an excellent job at interpreting, which I think would probably be, I mean, you would obviously know better than I do. I think you're more skilled at it, but from my understanding, you definitely do an excellent job. But I did want to start to maybe lean into our initial topic of the day, kind of, and that would be our new favorite topic here on Our Thoughts Tonight, Jean Baudrillard.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask right out the gate, what do you think Baudrillard would think of 2022, I guess I should say now, and Happy New Year. What do you think he would think of the contemporary world? I know it's only been about 20 years since he's passed, or so, close to 20 years, but a lot of things have changed. Yeah. How do you feel his criticisms would go?
That's a good question. He died in 2007, so it's been about almost 15 years. Well, he has this one text I think it's from The Illusion of the End that he wrote at some point in the 90s, in which he jokingly said we should put out a poll to see if we should just zoom past 1999 and jump right to the year 2000. And in that, there is a kind of, obviously he's being hyperbolic, but what he's trying to do is to propel the system to its conclusion, which he thinks has both already come and it's still to come, which is a very stubborn way of saying that he didn't really know, in my estimation, what the future would hold. But what he did know was that it maybe wasn't so good. So one of the ways that he feared it was a fear of what I will say quite simply is fear of this thing called the simulacrum. And maybe it's easiest to understand this like in one of the analogies that he gives of this kid in the sick kid in that bubble, the bubble kid, who is completely cut off from all like possible disease and infection in order to live a purely sanitized life. And he has this one funny quote, and it might be in this text, The Illusion of the End, but it might be in some of his journal texts called Cool Memories. But he has this very funny moment where he's imagining the future, a future that's perfectly sanitized, a future that's perfectly clean, essentially. And one of the things that he says that this future would not have is scorpions. And I don't know what, like, I guess he was scared of scorpions or something, but he thought that scorpions were unsavory to him. So the kind of future that he would fear is one that is perfectly sanitized, perfectly clean. And some of the different kind of cultural artifacts that he looked at to try and understand this would include pornography, would include the internet, would include the internet broadly, would include even architecture at some point, would include art, that all sought to get rid of what we have collectively deemed unsavory. So pornography might be the easiest way to look at it, where in porn, people aren't allowed to have body hair, people aren't allowed to most likely smell bad or to sweat very much. It's all meant to be very clean, very sanitized for the viewer and for the participants. And what that does is it instills in us, and we are making the assumption that viewers are actually going to be affected and going to essentially want to replicate what they see on screens. So assuming that this is the case, viewers are going to want to replicate that and are going to want to arrive at a specific version of sex that is whitewashed, that is completely clean, which Baudrillard is not interested in. Baudrillard, at some other point in one of his texts, I believe it's in The Transparency of Evil, but it could be another text, when he says that evil is not the way we think it is. Evil is actually when there's an absence of evil, when there's just pure goodness. And he saw this prototype really unfold with something in the Holocaust, which when he was a young child, he had lived through. He wasn't in a concentration camp, but he was born in France in 1929. So he was about 10 or 11 years old, I believe, when his family had to flee. And I think that they fled on horseback, I think, in like a carriage. Wow. Anyways, so what he saw occurring there in the Holocaust was a complete kind of perfect erasure, trying to leave absolutely no trace, getting rid of everything unsavory, from, of course, Jewish people to Roma people to gay people, like so many different people that to the Nazis were unsavory elements of their lives that they had to strip away to leave this perfect thing in its stead. And that is the future that Baudrillard, kind of envisioned in some form or other, obviously not to that same extreme extent, but he uses that as a sort of a way to understand an obsession with perfection and the horrors that it can culminate into in its effort to get rid of the negative.
I don't want to stray away too far from Baudrillard, but that kind of brings up a question. I think your most recent video was on Cesar's discourse on colonialism, I believe, and you mentioned Nazi ideology and whatnot. And again, not to stray too far from Baudrillard, but like the ideas of like purification and otherness and kind of this isolationist attitude that you kind of see in the Euro-Christian worldview. There are some writers, I think Rauschenbusch, who like did work on the social gospel. Like there are some talks of like all this kind of being rooted at like early Christian ideas of like, detachment from like the material world or something, the St. Augustine, or the earthly city and the heavenly city and all that. So like, could you perhaps interpret, your prediction of what Baudrillard would have said or would say, like, as just a continuation of this Euro-Christian value of like, is that influence what's driving that purification aspect?
I think in part, insofar as this Christian tradition, and we get this in Nietzsche as well, where Nietzsche describes what he calls the ascetic priests, who are these figures within the church who are like, we must repudiate everything to do with the body. We must repudiate pleasure. We must repudiate contradiction. I was
going to draw that comparison when you mentioned the fear of like sanitation in the future. Kind of remind me of that parallel.
Yeah, in favor of a kind of perfected model of being, be it your body, be it social organization, and so on. And the way that Nietzsche decried this and challenged this was to say that, that's kind of all we have. We only really know that we have our bodies, and our bodies are driven in ways that, we don't really understand, and we are often at the whim of. So it's totally ridiculous for us to deny that. And insofar as this long Christian tradition has been interested in moving away from the body, sins are all focused on the body. Gluttony, lust, right. Envy are all bodily feelings that we have, that we feel for other things. They aren't, intellectual ones, so to speak, or at least not most of them. And so what that tells me, and how we can understand Baudrillard here, is an obsession with this thing called of intellectualizing in favor of coming out with like pureness, which is for him was the most concerning thing. Him was this concern with getting rid of all evil, all badness, in favor of just perfectly clean, easy explanations to the world. And one of the ways that he illustrates this is with a story called I believe it's called The 9 Billion Names of God, and I think it's from Arthur C. Clarke, where the story involves a number of, I believe they're Buddhist monks, and I believe they're in Tibet. And all they do all the time is count the stars and name the stars. And then one day IBM rolls in with one of its machines and says, hey, you guys, like, we can do this in like a month. So they did it in a month and named all the stars, and the world came to an end, because that's what the monks had prophesized. When they'd finished this job, the world would come to an end. So in this immediate, perfectly rational artificial intelligence in this machine that was able to complete this task, it essentially accelerated the world's demise, because it brought everything immediately to light. And by virtue of that, by getting rid of all mystery, which is the stars were the last mystery, essentially, by getting rid of all mystery, what we are left with is a perfectly real world that has everything explained. And when that happens, when mystery no longer exists and everything can be explained away, everything can be understood, it marks a sort of symbolic death. And the way that Baudrillard would use the term symbolic is different than the way I'm using it here, but it would mark a kind of symbolic death, because if you knew, for example, what everything in your life, what will happen to you, it would be devastating. And there would be no surprise, there'd be no wonder, there'd be no intrigue. You would just be complete submission to an ordering that has already taken place. And I mean, was Baudrillard's fear. And we see this to really, I think, come back to your initial question, in the way that artificial intelligence is working, in the way that, and this, we can look at this tangentially in so many different ways, the way that artificial intelligence is able to predict our buying habits, for example, where Amazon knows effectively what people are going to want before even they do. And in all of this is playing out essentially a desire to map the world perfectly in order to get rid of all possible ruptures, all possible contradictions, in favor of a perfectly real, mappable, explainable world that is without mystery, without fun. And yeah, that's the future that he feared. And this is a future that is going to be crafted by developments in technology like artificial intelligence and other simulating apparatuses.
Yeah, and I'm hearing maybe a little bit of connection here with correct me if I'm wrong, but with some ideas of like hyperreality, because you're describing this as a this discovering of the real, like what's going to happen and all that. But like, I guess, could you interpret that as like, that's taken away from like the quote unquote real experiences that in itself is creating the simulacra. It's creating this sort of hyperreal situation where you're not actually experiencing the mystery that's supposed to be natural and all that stuff. And I think that kind of gets to the crux of Baudrillard. And I guess maybe just to the audience, like, do you want to define, maybe what simulacra or what hyperreality would be, at least to you? Because I know there's different interpretations and stuff.
No, I have the right answer. No, I'm kidding. I don't. There obviously there are quite a few debates about this, but quite a few people get it wrong. And I'm able to say that there is a wrong way to understand this. Whether or not there's a right way, I don't know. but there are wrong ways.
I like your distinction that they are not two separate worlds, or two separate realities, I should say, and just intertwined with one another. I think, if I'm not mistaken, you say that. Yeah,
absolutely. And the place to start with this is his seminal text, Simulacra and Simulation, which, if anyone's seen The Matrix was modeled off of this text called Simulacra and Simulation. And that text begins with one of Jean-Louis Bolge's fables, in which a map has been created that perfectly covers the territory that it's representing. So the map has gotten so big that it physically completely covers a territory. Now, in this fable, this was meant to signify that there's been a kind of removal from reality in favor of this map that is only a representation of the real thing underneath. Now, Baudrillard presents this fable and he says, we no longer have this. And the reason that we no longer have this is because we cannot actually tell the distinction between the map and the territory. We don't know if the thing that we're looking at is the real thing, and we cannot say definitively if it is or if it is not, or if there's a reality underneath it. So he just kind of scraps that possibility right out of the gate. And he turns our attention instead to the question of what it would necessarily mean if there was reality in the way that we might colloquially think of it, like reality existing thousands of years ago when people were just, obviously they weren't simulated, like this thing called reality occurring before technology, before the ideology that we currently live in, or what have you. Reality in the most colloquial sense. And we don't really get an answer to that in that text that is in Simulacra and Simulation. In order to get, in my opinion, the most clear understanding of what he means by this, we actually have to jump about 10 years to the release of his text called The Perfect Crime, where he describes that there are two kinds of reality. There is either conflictual reality or non-contradictory reality. So he says that conflictual reality is that reality we understand in the most colloquial sense, the reality that existed thousands of years ago. And he says that this is conflictual because he says that the world doesn't make sense. It's never really made sense. And we get this through the work of also Albert Camus, who writes The Myth of Sisyphus, where Camus describes the absurdity of life being the experience of trying to understand a world that cannot be understood, the experience of trying to understand something like suicide that can't really be understood, the experience of trying to understand happiness and joy, that things that, and any of us can probably attest, like we don't even understand ourselves a lot of the times the way that we feel in our daily lives, which is why, obviously therapy and other practices are quite instrumental in helping us try to figure this out as best we can. But the world is ultimately ungraspable and ununderstandable. And so for that very reason, he says that reality, the colloquial thing that's been around forever, is conflictual. It just doesn't make sense. Now he contrasts that with non-contradictory reality, which is a reality that claims to know the answers, to know, well, if we just do X, Y, Z with your brain, you will feel happy. If we just do this with mathematics, we can solve this problem. If you follow 12 rules for life, you will be happy. All BS that's just like, we know the answer, take this blue pill and you will be happy, and that is it. Now, in terms of the simulacrum, or how the simulacrum fits into this, Baudrillard equates non-contradictory reality, that is this reality that claims to explain everything, to know everything, with the simulacrum. It is just living in a world of images that can be easily managed, that can be easily understood. It is kind of reducing the world to an image that can be mapped and categorized, explained, taxonomized. And he associates then non-contradictory reality with the simulacrum. Now, by contrast, to return to conflictual reality, he associates that with illusion. So illusion is, the remnants of mystery. It is not knowing what is going on. It is the submission in part to images that we can't understand, that we don't understand. And for very long throughout human history, And we're really starting to understand this more clearly, or understand it, realize the magnitude of this phenomenon in a lot more detail with various archaeological efforts going on in the Middle East, with certain cities being found, like Ketohoyek or Jericho, or any of these other cities unfolding or being dug up, where iconography played a big part, and where people were creating images of other things, simulations, if you will. They were just copies of things in the world. And through that was not an effort to, as far as we know, to make the world more understandable, but to contribute to the mystery of the world, to contribute to the non-understanding of the world, which is what in a lot of cases art even today can do. So we have, on the one hand, conflictual reality that he aligns with illusion, and then non-contradictory reality that he aligns with the simulacrum. So we have reality can exist on both sides. Reality isn't necessarily opposed to the simulacrum. In fact, and the term you used earlier was hyperreality, in that the situation we find ourselves in is an excess of reality, reality being made so apparent that it can be understood and mapped and graphed and so on, versus a reality that is evading us, that is always illusory and exists in the world of illusion. So that's just a sort of preliminary distinction to be made here, where reality and simulation, and these are his words almost verbatim, reality is not the opposite of simulation or simulacrum. In fact, they can really work hand in hand to realize this end goal that claims to know what reality is, what material is, what the world is, to know what reality is. And that can be used to justify people saying, oh, well, I have the answer because I understand reality.
And I guess this might go more into your personal opinions, but as far as I know, Baudrillard wasn't even too much opposed to "quote unquote" leaving the simulacrum. It's not good, but it's not something that you leave. And I think you're mentioning this in your Baudrillard and Deleuze versus video, basically. So I guess as in your own personal opinion, like, would you agree that would you agree that the goal is to go underneath the simulacrum? I know they're tied, but like, would you want to? Is that really the goal, to return to nature kind of thing, or like you said, just to keep going with it and kind of see where it leads, or to work with it?
I think you made the distinction, Ashik, like when in our first episode covering Baudrillard or hyperreality, where you're like, he doesn't necessarily say it's bad, right?
Yeah, I mean, like it's bad, but like as far as I can tell, it's euphoric.
Yeah, more good than good,
right? But I think in your video, or when you were talking about Lupus and all that, it's like, how would you put it? Like basically, this underlying reality, or at least the unhyperreal, I suppose, reality. It's still, like you said, it's mysterious. It's there's it doesn't make sense and all that. So yeah. So I guess what's your stance on that? Which stance would you go with?
Yeah, and to just briefly say, to relate this to the Matrix, Baudrillard said that we have a cultural obsession with this idea of escaping technology, escaping hyperreality. And we see this beyond the Matrix too. We see this with television shows like Black Mirror that, say like, this is what technology is what's going to screw us up. Essentially, it's going to ruin our social relations. It's going to do X, Y, and Z to us. It's going to take us away from reality. Where Baudrillard is like, no. All that is doing, including the Matrix. And for those that don't know, the Matrix depicts a computer simulated world in which people are forced to live as their bodies are being harvested for energy by robots. So they are put in a dream state, and with the right intervention, they can escape this dream state to return to reality. Now, what Baudrillard said about that was that that's just going back to this old fable that there's a map, and underneath it, we know there's a territory. We just got to dig underneath and we'll get to reality. Now, Baudrillard says, we don't have that anymore. There isn't such a neat distinction. And it's funny because he criticizes the Matrix for producing this kind of silly version of his philosophy. when in fact the Matrix actually does play with this distinction a little bit, where in the movie, Neo is able to use his powers from the Matrix, from the simulation, in the quote unquote real world. He's able to move things with his mind. And, it's just one part of the movie, but it does problematize his idea that there's this very clean split in the movie. But anyways, culturally, we have an obsession with returning to reality. And this manifests itself in other ways too. Like you mentioned, if we just go back to nature, it'll be fine. But Baudrillard's response to that, if I can just speak for him, would be that nature is itself part of this simulated world, in that it exists as a necessary antidote to its opposite, like urban life, like city life, like technology. We need this opposite in order to keep the system in a kind of equilibrium, which he says is operational for us to keep the system going as is. Now, I'm assuming, of course, that not everyone is just going to, participate in an exodus into the forest right now. I mean, that might realize the thing that he's envisioning. But for him, I think that the solution, if I dare call it a solution, is a little bit more radical. And by radical, I mean maybe not as clear. And it is open to a lot more interpretation and negotiation, which I think is something he wanted. Whereas just going back to nature is a pretty clear-cut, easy answer that he would be a little suspicious of by virtue of it being easy. Now, his thing is that no matter how perfect the world gets, like no matter how amazing artificial intelligence got, machinic deep learning got, or like neural nets got to understand the human brain, there are always going to be elements of human activity that will evade that knowledge, or at least this is the hope that he held out for. And he says that in those moments are the remnants, or the vestiges, whatever fancy word we can throw in here, are relics of this thing called illusion, of this thing called conflictual reality that we've had forever. And we get this most clearly in one of his texts. I believe it's The Transparency of Evil, when he's describing an orgy scene and people are just giving themselves completely over to pure desire. They're just existing like just absolute submission to desire in the most like obscene possible way. And he says that at the end of this scene, one person leans over to the other and whispers in their ear, like, and what are you doing after this explosion of obscenity? And he says that in that moment where the person asks and whispers into the other person's ear, what are you doing after this, is opened up again this possible mystery, this possible unknown of what will happen. Whereas in the orgy he describes, everyone knows what's going to happen, and it's just going to happen again and again and again and again. And there's no mystery, there's no seduction, there's nothing exciting about it really. But in that moment, there's that possibility of it coming. So with Baudrillard, and I think this is a point that would certainly be up for contention among Baudrillard scholars, is that I don't think this can be forced in Baudrillard's work. I think that it can be found. It can be found in moments that maybe don't make sense to us. And he has this very wonderful passage out of one of his cool memories when he's meditating on what it means to lose a friend, to have a friend die. And he says that the death of a friend finds its justification a posteriori, which is to say that you cannot beforehand comprehend or understand why you might lose like a friend for whatever reason. But he says that you find the justification for it after the fact because it makes the world more understandable, or less understandable. It makes the world less clear. It makes the world more enigmatic. And he says that is the only possible justification, because in having the world be more enigmatic, we are in part making the world livable again. Because if it isn't enigmatic, if it's totally clear and laid out, there's no more room for living, essentially. Now, and this is a very, very grim way to look at it, I will concede, but I think that it illustrates the way that he would imagine us possibly operationalizing his thought, where the point that I would want to stress is that you can't force it. You can't exit the matrix, precisely because this distinction isn't there. And we have to find those moments within the matrix, and I'm just using the term as colloquially as I can here, that are remnants of a time long gone, that are remnants of what he would call, in this case, symbolic, things that are from a time that is from long ago. And yeah, that's probably the best way I can answer that question now.
That actually kind of leads me to one of my other questions, or kind of in relation. And in The Spirit of Terrorism, if I'm not mistaken, he talks about how the terrorists kind of used, that's funny, I'm thinking conspiracy theories now that you mentioned that, but they kind of used the Americans' own tool of media against them, kind of in a sense of like, by understanding that death had somewhat lost its meaning in the Western capitalist world, they would somehow bring it back into the picture, because he says, if I'm not mistaken, death has lost all meaning and only gets in the way of people's lives in Western capitalist nations. And to me, that's kind of him pulling from like a Nietzsche influence. I don't exactly remember how I came down to that take on it, but are you familiar with this portion?
Oh, I am.
You can probably explain it better than I can. It's been about this was one of the first things I read on Baudrillard, so it's been a few months, but
yeah, it's a fascinating idea, and his discussion of death extends earlier than that. And I think the first time he really develops that thought or thinking about death was in the mid-70s with his text Symbolic Exchange and Death. But there might have been a point in his third text, for a critique of the political economy of the sign, in which he thinks about death. And so I'm just going to, the asterisk is like, it could be one or the other, where he first talks about it. But where he really develops it is in Symbolic Exchange and Death. And he says that in a world that tries to be super real, in a world that tries to get rid of illusion, tries to get rid of anything it can't understand, that world will try to exorcise death. It will try to, like the exorcism, it'll try to conjure away death. It'll try to put it in a nice, clean, neat bubble, so we don't have to think about it, because we can't understand it. There's no possible way we can understand. We don't know what happens after it. We don't know what, if anything, happens after it. We don't know how it fits into what it actually means to live. We don't have the answers to these questions. And because of that, what we try to do is evacuate it of all meaning, so that it's just an end. We'll put it away and that's it. Let's not think about it. So how this manifests itself then in something like war is an obsession with clean war. So one of the mottos in post 9/11 America was this idea of no deaths, a logic of no deaths. But of course, this is only for one side. And we saw this as well in his other text, The Gulf War Did Not Take Place, where we are starting to see the use of drone-like planes that are able to shoot with perfect precision to kill a target without any casualties. At least that's the narrative they sold us. Of course, there were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi casualties that news media will try to, of course, hide and whitewash that these things didn't happen quite the way that they did. But because that there is this obsession with death not being able to figure into anything, the way that we conduct war has changed. Whereas previously, in historical instances, and maybe that's some of the easiest ways to think about this, is like ancient Greek type battles, where putting one's death into the equation was part of the excitement of the Iliad or the Odyssey and so on. Whereas now, because one side isn't putting death into the equation, then we don't see war the way that wars ever really worked out previously, which is why he's able to say the Gulf War did not take place. It did not take place as a war.
I think you can connect a lot of that, a lot of this with actually plenty of different thinkers. I think you can connect it with Heidegger and just sort of like avoidance of death. I think you can even connect it with Freud. I think even Ted Kaczynski, I was going to mention him earlier when we were talking about technology. And I guess, and I think you're kind of alluding to it, but I guess with the clean war and everything, as we're heading into this sort of quote unquote age of purification, I think you'd agree that it's part of that is it's wiping out death as even a concept, right?
Yeah, and you have Jeff Bezos dumping however many millions or billions of dollars and trying to extend life as much as possible. Now, obviously, life is sacred. How I know that, I don't. Like, I can't provide like some kind of proof for that. I don't. I've never had tea with God. I don't know what the answer to that is. But, life being a sacred thing, what is concerning is with the removal of death from the equation. And what Baudrillard says is that's like a removal of negativity, a removal of the thing that we don't know. Whereas for Baudrillard, when we do that, when we get rid of this possibility of death, we've actually symbolically, to some extent, killed ourselves, because we have just getting rid of this mystery first and foremost in order to leave like pure rationality in its stead. And he says in Symbolic Exchange and Death that all oppressions that we might recognize today in the contemporary world, be it the oppression of elderly people, of people of color, of indigenous people, what have you. He says, and what I think that there's good reason to disagree with him here, but what he says is that this all begins with a repression or an oppression of death, taking death out of the equation. Now suddenly, because death doesn't mean very much, it is real easy to justify killing people. Dropping bombs on people. And this logic goes comes much earlier than we saw with the Gulf War or with following 9/11, where, and there is a kind of history of thought around this with thinkers like Max Weber, and Emil Durkheim as well, who are thinking about instrumentality and reducing people to just cogs in a machine, essentially, and trying to rationalize everything. Now, that makes it real easy to drop a bomb on Hiroshima or Nagasaki or something for the greater good, it saved more lives in the end, as though anyone could possibly claim to have the moral superiority to make such a call, for example. So these logics have a history, and they come largely out of like Enlightenment thinking that would set up the conditions for something like the Holocaust as well. This just effort to remove people, like just liquidate them, and the horrors that obviously that portends. So his point then is that death is something that we have effectively, we're trying to get rid of as best we can because we don't understand it. And that is a sign that we get rid of things that we don't understand. So whoever's kind of at the helm of this will just try to realize that goal of getting rid of what they don't understand. And for my own part, I really try to embrace things I don't understand. And I don't know, this might not be the most therapeutic way to live one's life, but if I'm confronted with something I don't understand, I do my best to accept it, not to necessarily like figure out why that must be the case, which means that I often think I'm wrong about things, which is maybe not the healthiest way to go about living in the world. But I just kind of assume that I don't understand this, and therefore maybe I just am not meant to. Why should I feel like I have to totally understand something? And the same applies with death as well. Like, let's keep the mystery alive. Or one of his quotes, borrowing from Heidegger, actually is, behold the mystery of the constellation, or to be able to look upon something and actually be moved by its mystery.
Yeah, I think the connection with Heidegger is very clear, as well as this sort of being towards death, although I think he would tackle a little differently. But in terms of just really quickly about war, just a quick comment. I mean, there's like, I think I mentioned this on the first episode of Baudrillard as well that we had. Right now they have like, there's the whole idea of creating military technology for the actual purpose of dehumanizing, violence. I think that's basically, I hope not to sound conspiratorial, but that's almost become like an aim, that's almost become like, that's what, that's what the military is looking for. But also as a question in terms of death in general, and perhaps kind of with like what's going on, would you agree that like COVID and this entire pandemic, especially when it first happened, it kind of shook people in a very different way. It was kind of surreal. Do you think that may connect with this, where it's like, death is kind of, although at the same time, I guess you can argue COVID was, filtered through media. So I guess you can kind of have that argument as well. But do you think it kind of gave, I guess, humanity a shake and kind of realized the aspect of death? That makes any sense?
Yeah, maybe. But we're also seeing like people not care at the same time.
And denial.
Yeah.
And denial, like, of the severity of it, of course, which is, I think, to be quite frank, if Baudrillard were alive, he'd have some pretty problematic things to say. I think that he would definitely be in the camp that like, confinement is just an effort to try to free us from all germs and disease so that we can be like perfect bubble children. We have to just embrace this thing. I honestly think he would have thought that, which I think would have been wrong, morally, philosophically, intellectually wrong in every single way. And a lot of the time with his writing, I think that all he was doing was trying to throw thought grenades to try to stir the pot with things. But one of his insights that I think would actually be quite helpful in understanding COVID is with his concern with, to use conspiratorial language or anti-conspiratorial language, is as a concern with a new world order, which he uses these terms, and he uses them to describe a world that gravitates towards like a single world vision or a single world kind of ideology. And it is the ideology of, the UN or something. Or one of the ways I like to think about it is with air traffic control. And I have a friend who is actually a military person. And I asked him how, you communicate with, he's a pilot, I should say, how you communicate with people around the world, because he does reprehensible missions all across the world, of course. And he said that everyone speaks English, like everyone knows the codes in English. And the same applies in a lot of cases with like computer coding, where English is the lingua franca. It is the universal language of coding. And so we're seeing, like in the case of English, which is a narrow way to look at this, I will accept. It is, what we see is, in his words, is a mondialisation, which is a globalization of a kind of single language, of a single worldview. And this is happening. It's not just English. Like, of course, certain Chinese languages are imposing themselves on different parts of the world and at a rapid rate. Russia certainly wouldn't mind if Russian was the universal language. And so this isn't localizable necessarily to like a single part of the world. In fact, I think it communicates how this logic of trying to produce the world in one's own vision or one's own likeness as a certain country, be it the United States or China, Russia, whatever kind of the mega superpower there is, Europe, and Europe's long colonial history can certainly attest to this, trying to make the world Europe, communicates that globalization is an end goal. And the way that we saw COVID really move around the world was, in a sense, a product of this like complete global connectivity, what Marshall McLuhan called, of course, the global village. Like, we can just so easily move from place to place. And so it made total sense. And I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing that we have these abilities, but it did present this risk in with something like a disease that could just in a few days just completely engulf the world. It can completely just go everywhere. And so that, I think, is, if Baudrillard were to be alive today, he'd say, like, of course this was going to be the end result. I mean, we just made it so easy in our effort to make everything accessible, to make everything understandable. With that, we have also opened the door to, at this point, maybe one of the greatest threats that we've ever encountered. And he says that as we try to grow more perfect, more connected, more real, more simulated, insofar as reality and simulation are the same thing, as we move in that direction, we are going to open the door to greater risks that can be very easily transmitted around the globe. And he talks about this in terms of disease in his final years of writing, in texts like Screened Out or The Intelligence of Evil, where he says that disease will become a major risk when we can all travel and be around each other so easily, or with computer viruses where everything is connected. And this whole Y2K scare, of course, communicates this as well from 21 years ago, when the fact that we were all connected on these computers might have actually spelled our demise. Of course, it did not, because, people were working around the clock to make sure it wouldn't happen. But, all of these affordances that we enjoy present various risks. And Baudrillard was very cautious and very concerned with what these risks might be. And I think that in a lot of cases, he was really spot on.
I don't know. I'm generally a fan of Kaczynski's stuff, and I think you connect a lot of the stuff with that. I think when we were talking about technology earlier, there are some inherent hostilities, but just in terms of just making things easier, kind of makes things maybe not harder, but makes things more riskier at the same time. I think that's a pretty dangerous combination, for sure. Yeah.
Get it as well in Heidegger too, when Heidegger's talking about almost a quantitative shift in the way that we conduct ourselves technologically, and how this quantitative shift actually comes into be a qualitative one, where he compares the logging industry afforded by logging technology that could just decimate entire forests in a matter of weeks, compares that to someone going in the woods with an axe and taking down one tree. And there's almost like a relationship there with this technology, this axe that you take down, or even like a chainsaw. You just being one person doing this thing is qualitatively different by virtue of its being quantitatively different from a logging industry going out, mapping this territory perfectly to optimize its desecration in favor of the logging industry. And by virtue of that, we've entered into a new phase of a relationship with technology that is going to only end up harming us at the end of the day, where we are going to become subjects to this technology. The technology will essentially evade us, and we will become subordinate to it, not in a Terminator type of way, but in a way that, and we're very much seeing this on display, if we got rid of the technology that we have, people would die. And that's just what would happen. And it would happen on such an extreme scale that it's horrifying to imagine. And this dependence on technology being presenting this kind of risk is something that and I don't know that much about Heidegger. Of course, all the problematic stuff everyone knows is Nazism. It's something that can't be ignored. But his concern with technology, I think, was relevant, and it was something that I think that Baudrillard resonates with Ted Kaczynski, of course, like that. And so he's someone else I only know somewhat tangentially. Obviously, I get all the problematic, the whole hate. Well, yeah, all the problematic stuff. Obviously, that was ridiculous, and his disdain for technology, of bureaucratic living, and just instrumentality. Yeah, These were legitimate concerns, and they're things that we need to grapple with, because I think in the face of many of the things that we are confronting today, be it climate change, be it the deleterious effects of overproduction, of commodity goods, of you name it, the impending threat of doom. Many people say, well, we need more technology to fix this. We have to, we got to build rocket ships, and we got to go and colonize planets, and it's wait a second, let's think about this. Maybe that there's something else here that's guiding this use of technology in such a way as to make it part of the problem. Maybe we have to get at the root of these issues here, so that we don't just keep replicating this and kicking the can down the road, or this short-sightedness of, I've reverted into rambling.
Well, I think, and this might, I don't really want to move the discussion forward too much, but when there's the obvious critiques of technology, at least from Kaczynski and in terms of like hyperreality, and how it helps it with Baudrillard and stuff. But it's obviously, when we were talking about purification earlier, or at least, the idea of trying to know everything, there's a clear example of just the internet, that at least providing that access to know everything, or at least creating a situation where it seems like you can. And so the situations like that. But I do want to return to the idea of like things, just doing things because it's easy, or doing things to purify or whatever. And what I mentioned earlier with like the Euro-Christian worldview or something like that. And this might, I don't want to go too much into post-colonial or even decolonization and stuff like that. But like, do you think those kind of sentiments of humanity want to purify or just to uncover or things like that, do you think that's really a universal feeling within humanity, or do you think there are opposing cultural views? Like, do you think that's just kind of what's stemmed out of Europe, or just the Enlightenment or stuff like that? Or are there other more universal tropes of humanity that can counter that, if that makes any sense?
I think it would be naive to I'm not saying you're saying this. Like right. I'm speaking to certain strands of thought that I've heard that say things like everywhere outside of Europe is just like has always been like peachy green. Everyone's had a great time together, and there was no conflict. Like that is obviously very, very, very wrong. It is, to me, and in the case of like colonialism, which Europe obviously has a big hand in, but obviously so does like China with Taiwan and other countries around there, Russia, and what we're seeing now with Ukraine. Like these are all, well, Russia falls in the European camp, but I think my point is still there. Right. And of course, there can be examples of this found all throughout the world at all different points. Like this isn't reducible to Europe. But what is interesting, and I think that worth pointing out too about Europe, is just the magnitude of it. Like just disappearing entire continents of people, both through direct violence and willing apathy. Like, oh, this disease is going to kill everyone? Wipe our hands of it. It's fine. It's just the disease will do it. Who cares? Which is one of the most horrendous things I can even fathom. Like just the number of people that have died at the hands of European nations. And of course, this isn't all European nations, mostly, Spain and Portugal, France, England. So really like Western European countries that just the sheer amount of death, the sheer amount of conquest that they undertook, to me, very much like the Heidegger thing. While it might not necessarily be like qualitatively different from any other example of colonization that might have, and definitely did happen in other places, people were conquering other people for very long before Europe was a thing. Obviously, it is just in the sheer magnitude that it enters into a domain of its own. It is a qualitative turn that is, I think, has to really be reckoned with as a very specific thing on its own, not in like terms of colonialism generally that other parts of the world necessarily have done, and which are obviously bad. Like no one's defending that. And coming to terms with that, I think, is one of the first steps to make sure this doesn't happen again. And seeing how these very specific acts conducted by these specific European countries and the logics that motivated them. Why was there an obsession with going to all these parts of the world, extracting resources, spreading the word of God, subordinating people, enslaving people? Like, why? And when we can start to, I think really understand that, we can make sure it doesn't happen again, or as best we can make sure it doesn't happen again. And I think that, to keep this really within Baudrillard's camp being the focus here, I think that one of these logics, one of these motivating factors was a desire to make, to produce the world like Europe or like these countries, spread the word of God that we Europeans, we believed in to be the word of God. Let's enter people into the market economy because that is the best way to do things. We're seeing it. We certainly saw it after 9/11 with the illegal war in Iraq and Afghanistan, where it's like we have to, send democracy to these people. Like what? Like I would never, obviously Saddam Hussein didn't seem like a great dude. Like, let's be real, but 400,000 dead people for democracy is like, excuse me? Like, what is going on here? This is why this obsession with
what a strange time that mid 2000s was a real strange time in history, I think, where, that administration just kind of got by everything somehow, in a sense. And we're only, I guess, I'm assuming you're about the age of a millennial like me. I'm 29. I'm only now just realizing how preposterous that was. Essentially, it was just absurd how they just kind of duped everybody. But that makes sense. Like, in the name of democracy, that's rather bizarre. It's the antithesis of something of that nature.
And just the fact that likewise, like, I didn't know. I mean, we were kids, but it was like, yeah, that's totally normal. Like, yeah, I think that really speaks to how deeply entrenched these ideas really are. Mm-hmm. This obsession with going to other places and then, making them like us. And it's like, can we not, like, just, and, there are differences to be, or distinctions to be made from that and like humanitarian efforts if a country's like, help us. And it's like, okay, well, dude, they're very different. Like, can you imagine if China rolled into the United States to save Flint, Michigan? Yeah. Like, but like, why not? I mean, and obviously I don't want to just defend China's foreign policy. But like, it's like, what is happening?
Right. And I guess to maybe not reiterate, but you mentioned, Europe's actions in history are primarily only different because of, the quantitative, the magnitude of it, how much it happened for how long and all that. But you're right. And other places doing it. So I guess to reframe what I said earlier in a different light, and, apologies for the Kaczynski influence again, but like, I talk, if you ever notice in the podcast, I do talk about him a lot.
That's what do you call it? Reoccurring theme.
Yeah.
I always bring up Freud and Ashok always brings up Kaczynski.
Yeah. Kaczynski and Schopenhauer. Yeah. So I just want to, we don't have to stick with Kaczynski, but like, this is the mere fact that, like, I think you do see a trend of this with agrarian societies in general. Or at least, historically speaking, and obviously, nomads have waged war too for this and that. But I feel like just the mere fact that that agrarian societies can kind of develop very specific cultures that are, intact, for long periods of time. And, I think that can inherently speak to feelings of domination, feelings of expansion. You don't see it all the time, but, for example, China historically, they were for the most part isolationists during times, but even when they were isolationists, they still were on the world field. They still wanted, tributary states and all that. So there's always this idea of expansion. So I guess just to view it like that, should we trace all this? Do you think? Would you agree with that? Should we trace all this to the beginning of agrarian society?
Well, it's funny you say that because I have some thoughts. And this actually dovetailed with my interest in conspiracy theories, because I was interested in like what the history of conspiracy theories are. And I, following the Younger Dryas when like the world started to like warm up, and before agriculture, people could eat things coming out of the soil because, the soil was so fertile and rich. Like before people knew how to actually grow things, they could eat berries and stuff from out of the ground. And they probably thought like, holy shit, I don't want anyone else to take this from me. Yeah. Like, I want this to be mine. So this is why, and there are some, and I don't know how well accepted this is in these fields, but there are some anthropological theories that walls came before agriculture. Or there's one book, it's by a guy named Scott. I think Scott's his last name. I think it's a dude. Scott. I think it's called Before the Grain or Against the Grain, where he talks about how people had the capacity to build fortresses and defensive mechanisms before they had the capacity to actually grow crops. And I was like, well, maybe that was like motivated by a conspiracy theory, that these people were like, there are people on the horizon that are going to come and get this. Let us anticipate this threat beforehand. And so in that way, the conspiracy theory might have actually potentiated what we know to be like the state now. It might be like the reason we have history at all. It actually may have motivated this. And I think that there is like this, certainly a concern with what someone has. And if somebody has something else that you want, there's probably a concern with going and getting that thing. But the way that this plays itself out is going to be different if you are like a monolithic, technological, bloodthirsty nation going after people who are relatively not as technologically proficient in terms of like defenses from offensive tactics. Like they're obviously as proficient in other ways, be it justice or democracy or whatever, not necessarily democracy, but in social organization, what have you. When you have a country that is able to just absolutely decimate another country, we are not playing any fun games here. There's no, the playing field has not been set evenly in any way, shape, or form, and we are just confronted with something that should probably be condemned. Again, I haven't had tea with God recently. I haven't asked him this question. Like, is this something we can just outright decry? My gut feeling says yes. Whether or not I'm able to say that there's like the guiding impetus behind it is necessarily good or bad, I don't know. It's like that thing about porn. Like I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. Like I don't know that that's like, I can't say why that's evil, but I know it's evil. And I know it shouldn't happen, which I guess is my long-winded way of saying that I don't have an answer to your question.
That's okay.
Should we start maybe wrapping up slowly?
Right. I guess I just had one final question.
Me too, after you.
Yeah, this is not what we were talking about at all, but earlier. So just really off the cuff, you are interested in continental philosophy, right? I guess were you ever interested in analytic philosophy? Did you ever get into it as much? Or I guess what's your opinion on the analytic side of stuff?
I have good and bad thoughts. I've never actually really been immersed in it. Like my only real kind of philosophical interests have been motivated by this thing called continental philosophy. Mm-hmm. And I have nothing wrong with analytic philosophy per se or jumping into it. I in fact would like to read more, but there are certain things about it that I find are a little bit that irk me a little bit. And one of them is that analytic philosophers love creating fake scenarios to think about. Like they're like, what if a person was on Mars and like, right. Blah, blah, blah. Or like, what if you had the brain in a jar, or like, what if
and the swamp man, all that stuff. Yeah.
And like, this world is so rich. I mean, you could just think of like a real example. Like we are always confronted with, in the case of like moral philosophy or something, we are always confronted with things. And to me, in a lot of cases, this is what marks the distinction between continental philosophy and analytic philosophy, among other things, of course. But like continental philosophy is going to actually look at real life things and draw conclusions from that it then can offer as possible ways to understand similar like things. Whereas analytic philosophy is like, let us bracket off everything. Let's think of this imaginary thing, and then we'll see how that argument went. Let's see how that line of reasoning went, and we're going to put it back in. And a lot of the times it's super fruitful. Like, for example, the Judith Jarvis Thompson's in defense of abortion argument, however anyone might look at it, like morally, is a profoundly amazing argument. Like the way that she's able to take a ridiculous situation where there's like a music lover who kidnaps another music lover and hooks them up, like takes their kidney to keep like the supreme musician alive, and like forces them to do that as an allegory for something like abortion, while it's like not grounded in reality at all, revealed a lot about what that dynamic was necessarily like. And it was one of the best arguments I've ever encountered. And you couldn't necessarily do that without creating this ridiculously abstract equation. So I think that in a lot of cases, it's extremely helpful to be able to work in that tradition and do things in that way to create these abstract scenarios and then apply them to the real world. Mm-hmm. Even if at times I'll read it, and I've read a number of like student essays, and I'm like, oh my God, like I could think of so many like real life examples that would really hammer this home so much better, that I think would just be a lot more relevant. But I don't know. What do you two think? What about the distinction?
Yeah, I mean, like that's like I started out like liking continental philosophy a lot, but I realized that like I just transitioned more into the analytics side of things, mostly because I'm mostly interested in like metaphysics, logic, epistemology. So I find a lot of home with that, in the sort of like the fake scenarios, the very abstract mathematical things and stuff like that. But like I think that's usually the distinction that people make is like, the analytics got the great arguments, the continentals got the great conclusions. Try to work between them. That's usually what I hear, and I would tend to agree with that.
Well, just to ask, because I don't have an answer to this. I'm not
right.
trying to lead you to say one thing or the other, but like when Kant, for example, focuses on like human perception, mm-hmm. do you think that he is more welcome then among analytic philosophers or continental ones? And I don't know.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. I guess a good thing to point out is like I don't think analytics or continentals, for that matter, are really honed in on different perspectives. I think you can find a lot of not necessarily Kant, but like for example, Husserl is considered continental, but he's in terms of like his methodology and a lot of the way he talks about things, I consider him analytic. For Kant, I would say just the way he goes about doing things seems analytic to me. Some of his conclusions you'd probably find a lot more agreeance with people in the continental field, but I don't think his conclusions are anything that's like inherently anti-analytic, I guess you could say. I think it's just basically a methodological approach, at least in my perspective, because like,
systematic.
Yeah. It's it's systematic. It's very, and not to say the continentals aren't like that. They are. It's just, I think it's in a different way, I suppose, using analogies, using, like you said, more real life examples, something more grounded, where as analytics, it's more mathematical, and I think that has its own merits. I think that's better for argumentation, but you're right in that it does, if anything else, it confuses people, that's for sure. And there's like this joke I mentioned a few episodes ago where like, continentals are the kind of like the cool guys, they're the cool, sex hungry Foucault, stuff like that. Or like, and analytics are kind of like the nerds who try to be funny, and you can even see in their examples of like, them trying to be cool, like the zombie argument, or like, here's a swamp man, or here's a twin earth experiment, all that stuff, where they're trying to be cool and trying to explain things, but really this is too abstract. But yeah, at least for Kant, I would definitely say he's I mean, it doesn't apply to him, but I'd probably just say analytic, at least methodologically, for sure. Right. I mean, and it's not a clear answer either, so of course.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, well, first off, I know you did a poll on your channel a few weeks ago. I think you asked your viewers, who should I cover? And I saw Hannah Arendt on there.
Yeah.
That was my vote. I think you should definitely head that direction at some point. But I wanted to ask, what are you most excited, or what text, I should say, are you most excited about studying in the near future, in your future? And where do you want to take your YouTube channel in terms of viewership or stylistic direction?
That's a good question. The person I'm most interested in reading, maybe God. Oh, God would be good if God had a story. I mean, God, most interested in reading. Well, I'm reading Derrida now, and that's great. I like that stuff. But I'd really love to be able to get into and do the entire spectrum of German idealism with Fichte and Schelling and really know what's going on there. I think that would be neat. That's still a little ways down the line. I also am very eager to read the third volume of Marx's Capital. because I just want to know what goes on in that book that no one talks about, because it's like who has time to read all that.
Volume 3 too.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like volume 1, everyone's read the first few chapters, and volume 2, I don't know. But as far as like the future, I think I'll just keep doing what I'm doing. I lack the proficiency to be able to do any kinds of like, editing and like video essay stuff. And, there's so many other people that do that better than I could possibly do it. And I think that leave it to the professionals.
I like your format personally. I think that with YouTube, like I do video essays, video essay type stuff, and it consumes your entire life. But I think your format where, you're incredibly well spoken. So you've got, that down. It seems like you don't even do many takes. So it's like the way you explain it is very stripped down and to the point, and still very entertaining because you're very well spoken and well read, obviously.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I don't do many takes, and I don't do any editing except for cuts if I've like just lost train of thought for a second. And I don't know if it's because I've been doing this for so long that it's kind of become second nature, or if I don't know where that propensity comes from. But my goal, I think I'll just keep doing what I'm doing. I mean, I'm already like, just with the number, at least on YouTube, like subscribers and stuff, I'm just always blown away. When I first started this years ago, I was like, yeah, maybe a few hundred people might like tune in. And I've like kept that in my head as my standard, and everything beyond that has just been supplement. And I just don't like, I find it like quite, it's quite flattering, and I don't fully understand why there's so many people interested in what I have to offer when there's so many more entertaining things. They probably follow like all the different things, of course. So for that reason, I just think I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing, maybe integrating more of those like Baudrillard versus like Deleuze and Guattari things, or doing these types of comparison things as well, because people seem to like that. Obviously, well, not obviously, but the dream for me to be able to have the skill and courage to do something that like ContraPoints or Philosophy Tube does, or like Tom Nichols and other people like that are able to produce like very cool, well thought out, well scripted, edited content would be awesome. But I don't see that at any point in the near future for me. It is a good question though.
I do want to ask, because I know you study conspiracy theories, and this will be my last question, but are you familiar with Adam Curtis's documentaries? Because he does kind of cover in a few of them, the origins of various conspiracy theories and their effects.
It's been on my radar for a long time, because so many people have been like, watch it. And it's just one of those things that have consistently, I've just somehow avoided. But yeah, I'm very interested. I love conspiracy
hands
theories.
Down my biggest influence in terms of like film editing and writing, because he claims himself to be, or calls himself a journalist, and his writing is very journalistic, but from a past tense point of view. But I think you would enjoy it, and if you ever do watch, I would like to hear your take on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I know how to contact you on Twitter now, so
for sure. Yeah.
Two quick anecdotes. In terms of what you said earlier, you just mentioned you said you're trying to read Capital Right, Volume 3. Kind of a quick anecdote comment. I'm not sure if I even mentioned this on the podcast, but I had the Volume 1 in my car a few weeks ago. Yeah, I wanted to mention this. And then my car got robbed, and they took Das Kapital Volume 1, which is like, I don't know. I'm not sure if that's ironic, but like, it's like, damn commie got his stuff taken away. And the other thing I was going to say was, you mentioned you want to go into German ideals, and as we're talking about YouTube and stuff as well. Are you familiar with the channel Footnotes to Plato by any chance? I think that's he changed his name recently, but.
I don't think I am.
Okay, he does a lot of stuff in German idealism. I just thought, I don't know, like it would just, I don't know, it just seems to correlate a little bit. Because I'm super into German idealism, and particularly Hegel and Schopenhauer, so I see a lot of that connection going on. So that's wondered if you were familiar.
I'm not, but I'll look it up. I will need all the help I can get.
Right,
because after Kant and Hegel, I suffered. That was suffering to get into that.
It's torture.
Anyway, I want to say thanks for being willing to talk to us. I hope it wasn't too painful. But
oh God, no, not at all. Yeah. Jeez, I hope it wasn't too painful for you. I just got to ramble.
Very, very entertaining. Like I said, you're very well spoken and very insightful.
Right. I thought I was watching one of your videos right now. So yeah, it's even through this hyper real format. Yeah. So thank you.
God, happy to hear it. Thank you very much. You're both flattering me to no end. I appreciate it a lot.
Of course. Yeah. I'm sure we'll keep in touch. And thanks again for joining us.
Take care.
Oh, to write a song that has no meaning at all, that doesn't touch a personal nerve or heed a social call, that knows no up or down, that has no right or wrong, that doesn't need a reason to waste some time with song just like that old time rock and roll with the easy chords and a touch of soul. Give me old time rock and roll and I'll sing ba-ba shabba ben. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Oh, to sing a song that doesn't let it all hang out, that doesn't wave any flag or have any slogan to shout, that knows no east or west, that has no left or right, that doesn't throw any stones or look for any fight, just like that old time rock and roll with the easy chords and a touch of soul. Give me old time rock and roll and I'll sing ba-ba shabba ben. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Just to write a song that won't mend a broken heart, that won't woo you like a lover or promise a brand new start, that doesn't preach of rain and fire or heed any higher call, that doesn't need a reason to mean nothing at all, just like that old time rock and roll with the easy chords and a touch of soul. Give me old time rock and roll and I sing ba-ba shabba ben. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Just like that old time rock and roll with the easy chords and a touch of soul. Give me old time rock and roll and I sing ba-ba shabba ben. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Ba-ba shabba ben. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Ba-ba shabba ben. Whoa, whoa.